so that'll give me a chance to introduce our moderator, and he will be leading a panel of clinicians, a pharmacist, a physician, a clinical psychologist, and a registered nurse, who all have, in their own way, either clinical experience providing cannabinoids as a part of clinical therapy or research into cannabis as harm reduction during the overdose crisis. And their discussion will be led by Dr. Zach Walsh, a friend and a colleague at UBC and the BC Centre on Substance Use. Zach holds a PhD and is a clinical psychologist and an associate professor of psychology at UBC, and he directs the Therapeutic, Recreational, and Problematic Substance Use Lab. He has published and presented widely on topics related to medical cannabis use and cannabis and mental health. He is the lead investigator for several ongoing studies of cannabis use, including CIHR and SSHRC-funded longitudinal studies of the effects of cannabis legalization on health and well-being. And he's currently the PI of a clinical trial investigating the use of cannabis for PTSD. So I'm very happy to welcome Zach and his panel to our stage. Are they here? Yes, they are.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me here, and what's been really a terrific day so far. So I'm excited to keep that going, and I think one thing that's really come through so far in the presentations is that it's so important to get beyond some of these basic questions of whether or not the if of cannabis substitution. I think what we're seeing is that, at least for a subset of the population, this is something that is very much going on and that's very much important. So I'm hoping that this clinical panel will give us a chance to get beyond that, that sort of if substitution happens, and get into some of the details of how we can facilitate it, when is it most effective. We're seeing a lot of discussion of barriers to substitution. So how do we start to overcome some of those barriers? And how do we start to refine substitution programs so that they can best meet the needs of the individuals who might benefit from them? And, with that in mind, I want to keep my opening comments very brief, and so we have the most time to hear from really a terrific panel of clinicians and scientists and clinical researchers. So my work with substitution started probably around 2010. When I was working with colleagues on some early surveys of medical cannabis users, and some folks that are here, Riel Kepler and Philippe Lucas, really helped me to focus on substitution and asking questions about how are medical cannabis users using cannabis instead of other substances. And at first I was surprised to think about those questions, so it really was novel to me in 2010. And what our survey showed us at those times was really that we see very high rates of substitution. And it was not just for opioids, but for things like alcohol and benzodiazepines and tobacco as well. So I think, when we talk about opioids and benzodiazepines together, I think that's really one of the exciting potentials for cannabis, because so many people who struggle with chronic pain also experience anxiety and other mental health conditions. And it's also the vice versa, so that so many people who suffer from addictions and struggle with mental health and anxiety also have chronic pain. And we know that the combination of benzodiazepines and opioids and alcohol and opioids really exacerbates the risk for fatal overdose. So the potential for cannabis to serve as a substitute, not just for one, but for potentially a couple substances, really speaks to the potential public health benefits of cannabis substitution. I was also fortunate to assist with observational research of a substitution program that was being conducted through Eden Dispensary on the downtown east side. It was initiated by Adolfo Gonzalez, who some of you may know, and championed by Dee Brennan. And in that study, we're just starting to look at some of the initial findings from that, but we found that about 75% of the people who are in the opioid substitution program, and we're giving out capsules with balanced THC and CBD, 75% of those reported using fewer opioids, and largely due to better side effects, more tolerability of cannabis. And over 65% said that they would certainly use cannabis more as a substitute for opioids if it was more available. So what we're doing at our lab now is we're starting to expand our research to examine some of the more granular issues around substitution. We're looking at behavioral economics, how the cost and the availability of cannabis really impacts the acceptability of substitution for alcohol and opioids. Because we know that costs, when I talk about costs, I don't only mean financial costs, although that's certainly front of mind, but also the costs associated with barriers to access, with stigmatization, costs associated with, perhaps 10 milligram portions of cannabis in a legal market. How is that going to facilitate substitution, and is that a barrier? It seems like it certainly is. So we know that that has a big impact, those kind of incentives, and it might incentivize the use of other substances if we make cannabis too difficult to access. And based on what we've heard so far today and what we're seeing in the community, that seems to be the case with legalization, is that it may be incentivizing some more dangerous substance use by creating obstacles to cannabis access. So we want to try to quantify that and figure out how we can get a handle on that. And we also want to look at heavy episodic and binge drinking, because I think beyond opioids, that's a big issue, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit from Dr. Pauly about that today. But when we think about it, and if we look at it at a very basic level, we might see increased cannabis use when it comes to binge drinking episode. But how do we understand that more cautiously with what happens first? Are people using cannabis at the end of a substance using episode to wind down? Are people pre-treating with cannabis so that they use less of a substance in a given episode? I think those are all important questions that are going to help us to implement cannabis substitution in a more effective and thoughtful way. So I look forward to hearing more about that. And, I think looking at some of those questions, we're lucky to have representatives, as MJ mentioned, of several health disciplines. We have Dr. Carolyn McCallum from medicine, Aaron Sahota from pharmacy, and Bernie Pauly from nursing. And Dr. Pauly's at the University of Victoria, where she's running some studies of cannabis substitutions in that are going to get at some of those important questions that I'm highlighting in a more granular and organized way. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to the panel. We're going to give some brief introductory statements talking about their experience with substitution, where they see it going, what are some of the important issues. And I want to start off with Dr. Bernie Pauly speaking a little bit about the cannabis substitution program that she's initiating now in Victoria.
Thanks, Zach. I am very pleased to be here, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm a settler. I live on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, which is on the lower part of Vancouver Island. And I wanted to situate that because I'm going to talk about Victoria, which, although in the same province as Vancouver, is quite a different context when it comes to implementing harm reduction. I also want to say that I have no competing interests. I've not received any industry funding for my research or to attend this event, and my research has been funded by my Island Health Scholar in Residence Fund, but the Island Health has not been involved in the design or conduct of the research. If some of you are following the BC situation, you will note that on the weekend there was a passing of a resolution related to decriminalization and safe supply at the 2019 New Democrat Convention. And I noted that one of John Horgan, our current Premier's statements was, we're going to work and look at new therapies, new ideas, new suggestions all the time. And I was immediately struck by something that many people here today have already mentioned, and that much of our innovation in the field of harm reduction has come from people who use drugs. And they've been doing it for decades, taking action to implement harm reduction measures to save lives of members in their community and improve health and well-being. And we can think of examples, some of them right here In Vancouver, examples such as needle exchange services, supervised and assisted injection. And remembering that in the context of our current overdose emergency, it was grassroots activism and drug user organizing that established pop-up unsanctioned injection sites in a few major cities, which then the province wisely legally sanctioned by the ministry. You've heard quite a bit about the evidence, and what I'm going to talk about specifically is a cannabis substitution program that's run by a nonprofit, community-run organization in Victoria, Solid, who is an organization by and for people who use drugs. The idea of substitution actually comes from economics theory and describes how the availability of one product affects public demand for another. So people being able to make a conscious choice about using one drug instead of or in conjunction with others based on perceived safety and effectiveness for relief of symptoms, as well as things like accessibility and accessibility. And of course, we've got lots of examples like nicotine replacement therapy, opiate agonist therapy. So in the light of the public health overdose emergency, Solid decided to start a cannabis substitution program to prevent further deaths among their membership. Victoria has the third highest rate of overdose deaths in the province, and Solid members live those losses every day. As I mentioned, the program was initiated as a community peer-based approach. And the goal of the program were to determine whether people would substitute cannabis for more harmful substances, what impact it had on health outcomes, and see whether it reduced the overdose risk. So participants did intake and follow-up surveys related to their history of drug use, previous experiences with cannabis, and what they hoped to gain from the program, as well as how the program affected their use. So early on in the development of the program, so just to be clear, Solid runs the cannabis substitution program. They approached our research team at the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research to help with them design the internal evaluation, which we did. And we actually then conducted a secondary analysis of data on their program forms from 172 participants during the first year of the program, and our research was approved by the Research Ethics Board of the University of Victoria. So I'm just going to highlight a few findings from that evaluation and then highlight some thoughts on where we need to go in terms of research. The participants who we looked at reported using a variety of substances. Very few people were using one substance. The most commonly used substance was illicit opioids, including heroin, fentanyl, and a variety of prescription opioids. This was followed by amphetamines, cocaine, and in a few cases, there were some people using only alcohol, but actually very few. Some people have noted this already, but one of the important issues is that these individuals had a tremendous experience with using substances and long history of using substances. There were three main motivations for accessing the cannabis substitution program. The first, most commonly cited reason is people wanted to access cannabis to reduce or stop their use of other substances. For example, individuals said things like, I want to be opioid free. I want to keep myself away from hard drugs. And others mentioned wanting to reduce their risk of pharmaceuticals, prescribed or otherwise. The second reason was interest in using cannabis to treat physical and mental health conditions as well. And certainly among that was pain management, but also symptoms of anxiety, depression, and stress. A key motivation for the program was cost. All of the individuals that Solid serves are facing structural disadvantages like poverty and homelessness. So for example, one person indicated, I'm on PWB, persons with disability support, so I cannot afford to supply myself with cannabis, and others indicated they had no income. When we looked at the follow-up forms in this analysis, 71 participants answered the question about changes in their drug use. 58 of those indicated a decrease in drug use after starting the CSP, either minimally or almostly entirely. And some examples were, I've cut down on cocaine to once a week. I've been weaning down on methadose since legalization of cannabis. It's not so stigmatized. One individual, over the years, I've pretty much tried everything under the sun. My main choice is crystal meth and weed, but since starting the program, my meth use has gone down. So people are clearly substituting cannabis, not just for opioids, but for other types of drugs, but in their reductions are reducing and using it as an alternative to a poisoned drug supply. Withdrawal was also mentioned, indicating that taking cannabis helped with the symptoms of withdrawal for both opioids as well as alcohol. And many talked about it as a pain management strategy, sleeping better, reducing nausea, better appetite, better mood, and of course, reducing financial stress. People actually mentioned that they were able to allocate money to purchase food. So this program was developed in response to an overdose epidemic. And so bringing a safe supply to a community with people on fixed incomes. The model's embedded within a harm reduction service that includes education, advocacy, and support. And the interactions with supportive, non-judgmental staff at Solid were found to be a positive aspect of the program and key to providing ongoing community connections and services. So a program designed by peers and for peers that was couched in the realities. Clearly, we have lots of limitations to this small study. We've got a small sample. We didn't have a control or comparison group. It was a secondary analysis. But what is striking about it is that we were able to access information readily from participants, but we urgently need more clinical research. But I would say we do not need clinical research that replaces peer-led and driven models with medicalized models of delivery. Rather, we should take the opportunity to put at the forefront the clinical models that can reach people and are designed with the needs of people in mind. And so I will stop with that. And I think it reminds me that we should remember that innovation often precedes and leads the science.
Thanks. Aaron.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me this morning, and I'm very glad to be here. I wanted to ask a question before I go into a bit of my background. How many people here are healthcare professionals? How many people here are in the research community, or researchers? Okay, good. How many people are just generally interested parties in the cannabis space? Okay, so we have a good mix of folks here. I'm just trying to see how higher level I can talk about healthcare and so forth. But my name's Aaron Sahota. I'm clinical faculty at UBC. I'm a pharmacist by background, and I wear a few hats. I'm usually the guy asked about, well, hey, can you get me some cannabis, or do you have an access source, or can you link me with something like that? But beyond that, I think one of my interests definitely lies in the substitution of opiates with cannabis. And one of the clinics I work in, it's a multidisciplinary site where we see patient cohorts on the island, here in the Lower Mainland, northern British Columbia, and we are following these patients to see and generate real-world evidence to look at sort of, what dosing equivalents of morphine these folks are on for chronic pain management, and how we can dose reduce their opiates, as well as looking at sort of whether CBD or THC or what combinations work best for them. I'm also just co-chairing a consensus group where this past Friday, and I recognize a couple of faces in the audience here, we met in Toronto to look at sort of building a consensus guideline around kind of a boxed sort of means for primary care clinicians in Canada and the US for them to follow and kind of handhold if they have patients that present to them who might be suitable candidates to deprescribe opiates and initiate cannabis, how they go about doing that. And so it's kind of a step-by-step, almost toolbox. I think one of the challenges and interests also that I'm really kind of focused on is sort of that innovation adoption. I think the folks in this room are definitely the early adopters, and you have that left side of the curve where you have knowledge, you have comfort, but how do we diffuse that information, that knowledge to the larger community? And I think that's both within the public's sort of domain as well as our colleagues. There are a lot of primary care practitioners who are very uncomfortable with approaching the subject, and I think that's why we are working on these guidelines to really help them understand and navigate the space. I also, not as much, have worked in the downtown east side with patients who are addicted to various substances. One of the biggest challenges from a pharmacy perspective, and I know there's been a lot of talk about what is the role of pharmacy in this whole space, is it's a very tightly regulated profession, just as all the other health professions are, and so we can't dispense oils or inhaled product or topicals or whatever it may be. The regulations don't allow for that sort of framework right now. And there's been a lot of talk about dispensing products, but when you look at launching studies where you have patients that regularly come to the pharmacy for daily witness of Suboxone or methadone, it's an ideal sort of environment to monitor and provide a therapeutic intervention like medical grade cannabis, but the regulatory environment hasn't caught up yet, and that's both from a federal level as well as a provincial level. We have the College of Pharmacists, which regulates pharmacy as well, and I think we're slowly evolving in that sort of regards. For example, in Ontario, some of our pharmacy colleagues now have to get relicensed, have to take one of the certified cannabis education courses just to ensure that every pharmacist is aware if a patient does come to the pharmacy, there are real significant drug interactions that do occur. If you're taking a blood thinner, for example, like rivaroxaban, you could be at increased bleeding risk if you're taking CBD. Who's looking at that type of information? Who's consolidating and reconciling that information? And typically, we may not find that in an environment where there's no health professionals involved. So I think there's real safety considerations as well. And I think there's going to be a lot more opportunities for that diffusion. From also a perspective of the next generation of healthcare leaders that will be involved in interfacing with cannabis. We have a young group of leaders, and we've engaged folks like the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, including current health minister, former health minister who's in the cannabis space. And we looked at sort of what the role of young leaders are in healthcare to help push policy as well as generate real-world evidence, and looking at linking the frontline healthcare perspective with the larger conversation around public policy. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting, obviously, conversations around this, and look forward to interfacing with you with your questions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here as well. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, talking about cannabis, especially for opioid substitution and polypharmacy reduction. But before I dive into a little bit of my thoughts on that, just a couple of things. So I do have some conflicts of interest. I've accepted some honorarium from various industry people working with cannabis as well as other stakeholders. A little bit about me. So I'm an internal medicine specialist. I work with complex diseases, especially fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, and so forth. And I do work with chronic pain and complex pain, which a lot of them have in common, the conditions I'm working with. And that brings about a lot of other symptoms like anxiety, depression, sleep, and pain. So I tend to talk more about symptoms than I do diseases, because that's something all of my patients have in common. I also do a lot of work with cannabis. I've previously worked with a number of different clinics, and I was a pharmacist in my former training, and just realized that a lot of the pharmaceuticals out there just haven't been working for the patient populations I've been helping. And I also just want to kind of frame my context that I work in a medical cannabis clinic. We started 8 years ago. We've seen over 60,000 patients. We are in Langley, so it's definitely not the downtown east side, but I hope to share, some of the things that I've noticed, from the data we've been capturing there. And fortunately enough, some of my colleagues, including Dr. Alistair Barr and Will Panenka and Bill Honer, have helped me get ethics approval to start combing through that data and to start looking at trends, which I think can be very helpful. It may not be the exact population we're talking about today, but to extrapolate some of the findings there. So one of my passions, like I've mentioned, in terms of cannabis and opioids in particular is standardized dosing and the idea of standardized dosing as best as we can. So I was one of the co-authors of a paper dealing with this in terms of how can we safely do this, looking at starting doses, how to escalate appropriately, different routes of delivery when you would use oils over vaporization and so forth. And I really think that using that framework, it can certainly apply to every patient or even recreational user out there. I think it's just how we can safely use this plant. And I really talk a lot about cannabis as an adjuvant, so that means using it in combination with other treatments, not suggesting it's going to replace everything or that you just started and then you discontinue everything else on the list. I think we really need to be using just very gentle, rational approaches in terms of even how we taper medications. And certainly with the experience I've had with patients with pain, sometimes even though a medicine they may not think is helping them, if they just stop at cold turkey, I'm sure, Aaron, you've seen this, is that, they do have some withdrawal, they may have some side effects. And so I think that cannabis is really unique in how it can be used to help reduce withdrawal. That's something I've definitely seen in my clinic, is that patients notice, I've tried to reduce my methadose or methadone before. I've tried to reduce my hydromorphone, and I've been really sick. I've had, nausea and diarrhea and goosebumps and irritability and all those horrible symptoms. But when I use cannabis, it's actually been easier. And I can say compared to the other clinics I've worked in, I can maybe think on like one hand how many patients that I was easily able to get off their opioids in comparison to using cannabis. It's just like night and day. And so that's definitely part of the reason of why I've chosen to work with this medicine is, the evidence in terms of randomized clinical trials and that like gold standard isn't there, but I can't dispute what's happening in front of my eyes is that when I look at their PharmaNet and when you go back to the pharmacy, like they're not on those drugs anymore. And for 20 years they were. So clearly there's a change there, whether or not we have the evidence for it. But I think it's just really important to, have a reasonable approach and to be in discussions with other healthcare professionals, talking to their family doctors, making sure they're, well supported in their other conditions that they have, if they've got heart disease or lung disease, making sure that cannabis is appropriate. And I'm especially passionate about vaporization over smoking. I think smoking has tons of issues inherently with it, and vape pens and other things that we just don't even know enough about. Just being as safe as we can. Another thing I'd just like to mention is different research groups out there. I know a number of us, we've mentioned some interesting projects that have been started, and one of the groups I'm working with is looking at pre- and post-legalization CBD use in the downtown east side, so in the hotel cohort of 450 people who live in the downtown east side. So I think that will be really interesting to see. Jenna's already alluded to the fact that not many of the people she was chatting with have been using legal CBD, so I anticipate that may be some of what we see, but I hope that then can frame the conversation for how can we change that. We've got this new system emerging, but if we actually can't get access to the people who need it, then hopefully that research is enough to change laws in the city to allow for dispensaries, maybe nonprofits dispensaries. That's something, again, Jen and I have talked about that would be near and dear to our hearts in terms of really making sure it happens and we can do that as safely as possible. And I guess just another point to make is about impairment, and I know that's not the focus of today, but certainly I think it's an important consideration for a lot of my patients who work and who have children, is how can we really work with this medicine, and especially tolerance is something important for somebody who's never used cannabis to establish, and you can only do that by starting low, going slow, and having a very logical approach so that they are very aware of how they're feeling and how they'll they'll feel in 2 hours and how they'll feel in 4 hours. 100 milligrams, I heard earlier, the panel before, my patients, that would be like really, really intense, 100 milligrams, because I start them at 2.5 milligrams usually. So just recognizing that everybody is their own individual, they have other medicines on board, they've got other experience with it, and that there's different ways of doing this. And certainly from Dr. Ware's work, we've seen as well that medical cannabis patients frequently use a certain dose or number of grams per day, and they have a pattern of use. And I think a lot of us working in the space have seen that same pattern. So a lot of this may be a re-education for those with substance use disorders and how they've been using cannabis. Maybe if they had more CBD, they would be able to use less THC and get better benefit. And certainly I've seen that in my experience with people using opioids, not necessarily those that have substance use disorders, but certainly when I've tried to give some advice after a bit of coaxing, because they frequently tell me that they've been using cannabis for longer than I've been alive, and that I don't really know their situation. But what we do tend to see is that when they get some good advice and they start journaling or using an app that allows them to track their symptoms, we start to see that they just need the right plants and combinations of plants to get that good benefit, and that you don't actually need as high a dose as you think. And a lot of times you're just beyond where you actually need to be. It's just that plant in particular isn't working, or that root, so vaporizing or smoking isn't working for you, maybe consider an oil. And so I know we're all very interested in that. And then I guess finally, sorry, because I just have so many things that I'm trying to squeeze in here in my time. I think also looking at, cannabis may not be for everyone. There certainly are some relative contraindications to consider. However, to be honest, I've worked around a number of complex, considerations. Psychosis, when we talk about contraindication, it may be more THC, more so than CBD. And certainly the evidence is showing us that CBD has been safely used in those patient populations. I've also worked with some pregnant women and who came to me on high-dose THC, and we switched them to CBD again, not because I have good evidence for that, but because it was the decision that we felt when we evaluated everything was in their best interest, compared to being on, 5 and 10 grams of THC a day. So sometimes we have to color outside the lines, and I think we do the best we can with the information we have in front of us. But one of the contraindications that I struggle the most with is this of substance use disorder, and certainly in 2014, the Canadian, the Family Physician Group, who put out kind of the initial guidelines, or not guidelines, sorry, some guidance on how to use cannabis. They specifically say not in those with substance use disorder. And I think, the point is well taken that if you have issues with one substance, you could have issues with others. However, we all know that cannabis is safer than fentanyl and these other substances that can cause a significant overdose and obviously mortality. And we really need to kind of, think about how this all fits together. And certainly, we have to meet people where they're at, and the opioid crisis is just like such a big thing right now. I think that this is definitely something worth considering. And just throwing one comment to Zach, because I know he's quite interested in alcohol research. In our clinic, we've certainly seen that using cannabis in the questionnaires that we do, or just questions in follow-up that we ask, that people reduce their alcohol intake, and they reduce their cigarette intake, and not because they were intending that, but they say, oh, I didn't realize I really like the vaporizer because it gives me that same fixation, and I can still go out on my smoke break, but I'm no longer smoking cigarettes, or I think I must have been using alcohol for pain management and I didn't really realize it. So why it's happening, that would be great to figure that out exactly. But the point is, it is, and I think we also need to be capturing these really interesting things and trends that we've been seeing, because I think it can give direction for new research.
Great, thank you so much, and it's great to see that. I think we're touching on a bunch of the topics that I'm hoping that we'll be able to explore as the panel goes forward. Also, just want to mention in terms of conflicts that I've led research that's been funded by Tilray and by Doja. I don't get direct financial compensation, but I have been involved in those funded studies, and I'm grateful for that funding. moving on to questions now for the panel. Dr. Pauly, you mentioned moving beyond or not reproducing, I don't want to misquote you, not reproducing a medical model in the research. And I found that to be a very tantalizing issue as someone who's been trying to maybe fit cannabis research into the square box. I don't know if it's a square box or a round box, but however it is, one's square and one's round. And trying to fit that research into existing models has been a challenge. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. What might this research look like? What are some of the key areas where we need research to enhance clinical applications of cannabis substitution, and maybe talk a little bit about some models for delivery that you think might increase accessibility, because that's something that we've really heard time and again already in today's presentations is issues with accessibility. So,
I think that's a great question, and I think the natural tendency often is to move towards a more medicalized model when we're trying to get something accepted, because that's the dominant paradigm that we live and work in healthcare system. But as you know, and I think Dr. Blumenthal highlighted this, the amount of stigma and discrimination that individuals who use drugs feel when they access service is real. And it's a barrier to accessing medicalized kinds of services. We can even think of, I often think about what would we design Insight to look like now, as opposed to what we did, what was done 15 years ago to design a more medicalized kind of system. And I mean, our overdose prevention sites have highlighted here for us how developing a service that's really much more community-based, that's aligned with what people feel are safe and comfortable in the community. And I've really, learned from many of the individuals, and I remember the day when Guy Felicello said to a bunch of us, he said, we need to make the service feel like something where people want to come to, that doesn't feel too different than their own kind of community. And so the kinds of models that I think we should be looking at are really peer-based, peer-driven models that are designed by peers with their input. And I think we can compare the effectiveness of those models to other kinds of models. I think that would be a very exciting area of research. I've been wanting to do that for a while. And I think some of those models, we can also look at more flexible models where, peer or people with lived experience, they have the initial intake assessment entry, they're involved in the planning and collaborating with the rest of the healthcare team. And I think those are the places we really need to go. Let's not fall, and I think that's really one of my big messages around the research. Please, 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 let's not fall into the trap of making medicalized models so that we can get it accepted. Let's do it the right way.
thanks for that. I think that's such an important point, and we hear time and again, depending on the audience, but when it is a medical audience here, we need RCTs, we need those random controlled trials, and I wonder, can you speak to how that fits with that sort of emphasis on that putative gold standard?
I'm a community-based researcher, so one of the things that I have been a practicing nurse in the past, and one of the things I want to think about is kind of models of delivery that are fit with key principles of quality, like accessibility, affordability, acceptability, and equity. And those are actually for us in BC, those are in our BC Health Services Quality Matrix. Doesn't mean we have to give up RCTs. So right now, I co-lead a study, the Canadian Managed Alcohol Program study, which is providing safe sources, a safer supply of alcohol for people with severe alcohol dependence and homelessness. And in that, we are right now looking at the feasibility of cannabis as a substitution replacement for some of the alcohol, because you can imagine when people are consuming 11 to 12 standard drinks a day, chronic harms are high. And so in that study, in the feasibility study, we're actually working with community programs, we're talking to participants and finding out what would they find to be an acceptable way. We even have designed, people told us, I have to say we had some skeptics, but we designed our survey so that people are actually giving us feedback on what kind of model of RCT they think would work best, like what type of substitution, you know, and we've laid out for them the pros and cons of the different models. So I'm looking forward to having the findings of that. So, you know, I think that's where we're marrying community-based participatory types of research with our much, you know, highly touted rigorous studies as well.
Well, that sounds amazing. Aaron, for you, what would a multidisciplinary model of cannabis care look like? And where do you think pharmacy might fit into the conversation around medical cannabis harm reduction broadly and specifically when it comes to opioid substitution?
It's a good question. I think that you know, the environment that I'm currently part of, and specifically in the cannabis space, is very multidisciplinary. We have patients are usually given an expectation to wait book an hour to see the practitioner. So they're seen by a nurse, they're seen by a pharmacist, a physician, and then one of our care coaches. And one of them are actually here today, and they do an amazing job. I feel like sometimes, you know, we bring this team together, we get sort of the best possible outcome of care. We're not only assessing from a safety perspective, which is definitely foremost in the minds of when we're trying to look at, you know, the type of patient populations that would benefit from cannabis in general. So if they have pre-existing conditions or medications that we might flag in the system, but we're co-collaborating on one electronic medical record, and we're also following the patient through. So we're not just prescribing them medical cannabis-based oil and saying, okay, this will work for you, just we'll see you maybe in a year. The goal is to collect data that will guide and further refine our processes, as well as understand what patient populations benefit. By far, the most patients that we have seen come for a chronic pain issue. And, you know, I think that there's been a lot of talk amongst the media and industry that, you know, pharmacists should get the right to dispense. You know, it should be in a pharmacy chain or an independent, and you should go there with all your other medications to dispense. But even beyond the product, there's innovative new models where pharmacists are not necessarily dispensing, you know, a single gram of cannabis, but they're actively involved in providing value to the rest of the team by understanding, you know, what medication interactions would be of most concern. How do you actually mitigate and manage them? So if a patient is on a suite of medications, doesn't mean that it's a complete contraindication. You know, there's a lot of opportunities where we educate, we adjust doses, and we ensure that they're safe and effective therapy for them. And I think that is the way going forward. And I think, you know, with our, for example, I see a cohort in Victoria virtually, the role of technology is also changing the way we interact with patients. They're not necessarily physically just coming to a clinic. I think pharmacists, as we evolve in the industry, would be absolutely key, especially when it comes to dose titration, monitoring, and follow-up. And I think that, you know, I think you'd alluded to PharmaNet. It's one of our best resources and friends here in BC. And in fact, when it came out in the early 90s, I think was one of the most robust. And it gives the past 14 months of all of our drug history for any pharmacy you visited in this province. But, you know, having that set of data, reconciling it with the cannabis, we can look and see, you know, what morphine equivalents potentially this patient has been using for their pain, breakthrough pain, how we can adjust and cross-taper some of these opiates with cannabinoids. So I think there'll be a very interesting sort of opportunity for pharmacists to play. One of the other big challenges I do want to say is, you know, as someone who also teaches at the faculty, is medical education and pharmacy education. There's a big unmet need across the country, across Canada and the United States, in terms of integrating cannabis in learning. And I think that over time there has to be an acceptance, and, you know, even the body of evidence we have from a safety perspective is very important for clinicians that are graduating to have a level of comfort, and we're still not there yet. And I think I also just want to mention, in terms of disclosures, I have worked with industry in the past as well, including some recent projects in the cannabis industry. So just wanted to make that clear as well.
Thanks. You know, cannabis really, one thing that continues to surprise me as I work with cannabis is it really is a distinctive medicine, and I'm hoping that we're able to adapt some of our systems of research and working together in multidisciplinary teams, and maybe it can help us to re-envision how we deliver care more broadly and in a good way. So it's exciting to hear about different ways that people are working with cannabis. Carolyn, I wonder if you could tell me what advice you would provide clinicians who are considering recommending cannabis substitution for opioids or other substances. Are there a few key clinical considerations that are top of mind when it comes to optimizing benefit in terms of routines, dosing, and maybe even talking a little bit about some of the concerns and risks that come with substitution?
Right. So thanks for that question. Sorry, I probably answered a little bit of my questions. I ran into them when we were just doing our intro. So in terms of the approach that I would use for any person using cannabis, it's usually fairly standardized. And I think it's important to have a framework and then to fine-tune that depending on the particular patient population. So one first consideration would be, when are the symptoms occurring? Are they daytime or nighttime? I use the analogy of a cough and cold product. So sometimes you use different products for different times of the day. So certainly for daytime, I always like to try to start with CBD if that's possible. Considering cost is usually the major player here with CBD. Driving, if they've got children, that sort of thing. Some people aren't able to take THC in the daytime for a number of reasons. However, considering people on using opioids, I do think that I find that CBD usually isn't enough to kind of cut it for that coverage. So a lot of times they do end up with some THC in the daytime. Another consideration would be the type of symptom, like if it's acute, if it comes on quickly out of the blue, is it intermittent or is it chronic? Is it the same every day, 24 hours a day? And so that's where we look at if it's acute, it may be using something like a vaporizer, which works quickly and wears off quickly, or smoking would be equivalent in terms of absorption to vaporizing, even though, as I've mentioned, vaporizing would be preferred. And then chronic would be oils. So using oils, a number of patients start with a couple times a day and they work their way up. And it really depends on the person how long that medicine lasts for them. So again, trying to get on top of symptoms and preventing symptoms versus chasing symptoms. So certainly I've seen patients who come to me smoking, 10 times a day, and that's because they just really can't get it to last for them, and especially if they're using quite a bit of THC. So considering an oil in that case, looking at the nature of the symptom. So if there's inflammation, CBD makes sense. A lot of times there can be other components, and certainly chronic pain and opioids, I do find, as I mentioned, that THC can certainly be synergistic. And other conditions like neurological pain, again, can require THC, and PTSD, migraines. There's certain conditions that I've seen just tend to use more THC than others, and sometimes they'll even say CBD doesn't work at all. That's up for debate, and we certainly need more research. And then the special considerations. If you're starting somebody who's got, a side effect, a condition like an arrhythmia, you're going to want to be very careful with your starting dose of THC. And likewise, I've mentioned some other conditions like psychosis that you would want to consider possibly avoiding THC initially and having a generous amount of CBD on board before starting THC. And then again, in terms of how this would be different than any other patient that I see, I do find, as I mentioned, THC, they tend to use more or just CBD alone is insufficient. And then a lot of times they'll even find that they need to increase their frequency. So not using it just once a day, they may need it 3 or 4 times a day. And so when they journal, they can really get a sense of when the medicine is wearing off for them, especially if I get them to track if they've got pain or withdrawal, depending on if they're taking their dose at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. they're having some symptoms, inserting a couple of extra doses can certainly be helpful. So in terms of an overall approach, I would say that's where I would start, and then I guess for doctors, if this is their first time doing this, there's going to be reservations, and Aaron's talked a lot about interdisciplinary, having support from pharmacists. It is a lot of work to do, and in my clinic we have counselors or support staff that help us, and doing this alone can be challenging because patients do have a lot of questions. And so it's like you may not be able to see a person every week, but if they can go to their pharmacy, that certainly really helps them. I think there's a lot of anxieties initially starting cannabis, is how will I know, and well, what dose, and what am I working towards? And so I think that's where charting can be really valuable.
it really sticks out the importance of listening to patients and having them track. And I think that can be so empowering for patients, in addition to the direct effects of cannabis, is having people track their symptoms and track their cannabis use. I know that came up in Neil Magnuson's presentation earlier on.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we have some time left for questions from the audience. So maybe just one more. And if everyone can take a shot at it, what are some of the concerns that you might have about substitution? Are there any? You mentioned impairment with parenting. For me, I think that's one of the big issues that's coming out, is we have this long-standing sort of caution around cannabis in youth as sort of the assassin of youth, and I think, we want to be aware and at our best capacity when we're parenting. But one thing that we've been seeing in our research, looking at medical cases in family law, is just terrible misuse of cannabis, both medical and not, in the courts, where people are saying that restricting access to custody and stuff like that amongst medical cannabis users. So I just want to highlight that as an issue that we need to look at, is not exaggerating the impairment when it comes to parenting, and how do we understand cannabis in the context of parenting. So I think that's one area that needs further examination and maybe destigmatization. I wonder if there's anything else, just briefly, that sticks out for folks in this area that they'd like to see more attention to.
There's two things that come up in the work that I do. One is predisposition to psychosis as an existing, medical condition, and pre-existing respiratory problems if the main mode is smoking. And we've had a lot of people tell us that they either have respiratory problems or they've quit smoking, so they really don't want smoking as a means of taking cannabis. They want other alternatives, and particularly edibles comes up repeatedly as a more acceptable form. So those are a couple for me.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think there's a few things that come to mind. Is when you're deprescribing someone off any medication, it's a lot of work. It takes time. It takes a gradual approach. It takes effort from the practitioner in terms of monitoring what to look out for if you have side effects. But you go into more sort of detailed classes of medications like benzodiazepines. Deprescribing someone off of benzodiazepine can be fatal if not done right. And it's one of those ones where, forget the cannabis alone, just going to look at sort of how to optimize a patient's medication, you really have to, I think, have some experience and some guidance, and really make sure that you're going to be vested in terms of the patient and follow through with them. It's easy to say we're going to cross-titrate and upregulate the CBD and take them off the opiates, but it's quite a concerted effort. And for primary care practitioners, I think the level of time invested is important. And that expectation at the beginning with the patient is that you may not completely get off those medications. You might lower your dose, which actually could be a win, depending on how you define your outcome measure. And it's not for everyone. I mean, we're still learning a lot more. So I think I don't want to leave the impression by saying it's the silver bullet for any medication to get you off of it. There's still, we need to do a lot more sort of investigations. I'm pretty excited with what MJ's working on as well, and look forward to seeing more of the outcomes. The other aspect is, dosage forms, and I do a little bit in formulation design when it comes to dermatological. So I work with a few dermatologists on this end, but I'm really excited about topicals. And some of my colleagues in this room share that, I think, enthusiasm with me, particularly transdermal pain preps, true transdermal pain preps, because as adjunct therapy for patients with osteoarthritis, which is an area where they'll look for anything, and we really haven't gotten any new therapies in decades. But as adjunct therapy, to neuropathic pain, I think that you'll find a market that will slowly be more comfortable with cannabis by starting with the topical route. It's a lot more acceptable. You're not ingesting, you're not getting a perceived high, whether it be a topical THC or CBD. So I'm really excited when those start hitting the shelves, and then maybe looking at some interventions and some research around, well, as adjunct therapy, what role do they have in terms of pain management? So, yeah.
Yeah, I would echo all these. These are all things that I certainly come across, and I think we need to know a lot more about. Another commonality that we would have would be about adverse drug event reporting. And so just like every other medicine, there's a means to report to Health Canada if we see any side effects that are unexpected from what we're expecting. However, I feel that probably in cannabis this is not likely done as well as it could be, and I think it's important for us to be aware of any of these sorts of outcomes and not just be blind to the benefits. And I think in that way we're going to be able to move forward with new delivery formulations and ways that we can mitigate some of these potential side effects. So for example, I don't want to say common side effects as if I see them in every single person, but the more common things I would see that wasn't on my radar when I first started working with cannabis, maybe diarrhea. And so whether that's related to CBD versus THC specifically, if it's more the oil, so the actual carrier, whether it's an MCT oil versus an olive oil versus a hemp seed oil, so sometimes it could be the carrier, and then, or could it be a terpene or something else in that plant? And certainly working with patients to move them along from, okay, if you're having it with the THC oil, what about THC vaporized? Does it still happen with that? So these are ways, but it requires a lot of troubleshooting, a lot of support staff to be doing this, and unfortunately government isn't compensating the support staff I have for their kind of knowledge, because they're not a physician who can bill, and different ways pharmacists can use PharmaNet and do consultation billing with the government. So I think it'd be really amazing if we can start to get some funding specifically, well, for pain and substance use overall. Different billing codes will allow people to spend more time with patients, and also for physicians, I think it's being able to spend the appropriate amount of time, because for family doctors doing this work, their billing codes per patient are very short, and they end up spending, unfortunately 5 or 10 minutes with a follow-up, whereas as a specialist I can spend a bit more time. And so it'd be really great if we can start to make this more equal in terms of the support that all patients can receive. And also the vape crisis, or I'm joking when I say that, there's a number of unfortunate deaths, but I feel like we get all bent out of shape as soon as something with cannabis happens. However, I just want to remind the audience, over 100 people die every day from smoking cigarettes, but we don't talk about that. And so it's just, cannabis is under the microscope, and yes, we definitely need to figure out if it's a solvent in the vape pen, or if it's something that's been added, a vitamin E acetate, or what that is, but to not dramatize this and be an alarmist about it. It's just, unfortunately, when you have unregulated markets, these are things that start to come up. And one more point I'll make is, I have concerns about inhaled nicotine products. I've unfortunately seen some young people in my clinic, which, interesting enough, came to me for cannabis, for anxiety. And just luckily, I always make their mom come if they're under 25. I have a few patients under 25, and I just happen to say, "Oh, have you ever used nicotine?" And her mom, gave me a funny look, and so she's using this vape pen every hour, like on the hour, and using over probably 100 milligrams of nicotine. So not smoking it, but ingesting 100 milligrams of nicotine, and clearly jittery and anxious in front of me, and wanting cannabis. And so at the end of the day, what I actually did was we tried to design a nicotine taper, because that's more what she needed. It wasn't using CBD on top of this. So I think that it's easy to focus on cannabis, but there's a lot of other substances that are kind of confounding things and making it really difficult to tease out what's actually happening.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that's clear, it's that when we talk about cannabis, we can't talk about it in isolation. That's why it's so encouraging to see an event like this that talks about cannabis substitution in the context of other substance use. I think we have time for a couple questions. I see a couple hands already. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Rachel Caesar from University of Southern California. I was curious what you're seeing in terms of cannabis with maternal health, particularly during and after pregnancy with women and the use of cannabis.
Well, I'll let the physician speak to that specifically, but one thing I know from our research is we see a lot of stigma that I don't think is well, certainly it's stigma, it's not well-founded, but a lot of concern around that and a lot of secrecy that can interfere with getting the kind of expert advice that would optimize, good use.
Yeah. So, as I've already mentioned, not a lot of good concrete evidence out there. So, speaking from my personal experience in the clinic and where we've gone with this, so I've been, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but I haven't actually been referred that many patients who are pregnant, and I think it's because they're potentially their doctors don't want to deal with it at all, and they just say you shouldn't do it, and I don't think that that's enough really in these circumstances, because the reality is they are doing it. So it's having the conversation and normalizing that and referring them to somebody who can actually support them in that. So for the women that I've been referred, they were already using cannabis before they were pregnant. They were self-medicating for anxiety. They were not getting medical advice. They were doing this on their own. And so how their patterns of use continued throughout their pregnancy, but they recognized that they wanted to do something different. So when I've seen them, we've discussed CBD as, in terms of kind of what we know from animal studies and grabbing from I guess we don't have long-term studies on CBD in children after their mother was using, but certainly it appears to be less harmful. So working on that and using oils instead of inhaled products to give them better duration of action, that's been helpful. And if I've had a couple where that hasn't sufficed, using small amounts of inhaled THC versus oils that are, there for longer duration of action. So minimizing the exposure as much as possible to THC. So that's been a little bit helpful, kind of in my experience. But I know based on if I follow the guidelines or the guidance documents, it would be not to do it. But they're already doing it, so in my mind, I'm doing more of a harm reduction approach here, because it's what's required in the situation. And I think a lot of people have resorted, well, not a lot, but some of the patients that I've seen were using it because of nausea. That could be why they're using it, but a number of them were using it for pre-existing medical conditions.
And in keeping it in context, if people are using alcohol during pregnancy, if cannabis can be a substitute or help to reduce that, I think that's certainly a harm reduction.
We have an online question. This question was asked about 20 minutes ago, so possibly it's been answered. Bernie, what do you think are the next steps, and where do you see this work going?
I think some of them I mentioned already in terms of how we can design rigorous kinds of RCTs, rigorous studies. But the other area I want to mention, which has come up, is the importance of looking at self-management. Because I think, the last panel and this panel, we really see the theme that individual responses to cannabis and combinations are a really important area. And really putting that, I think, in the forefront in some of our work and using other types of methodologies, mixed methods, qualitative as well.
Hi, my name's Dean Wilson. I work for the BCCSU, but I'm also a longtime heroin user and activist in the downtown east side. I think I've got a bit more of a comment. One of the things that we need a lot more research on cannabis and withdrawal from opiates. We certainly need more, but it's pretty set in stone, and the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming that it helps. Yet, in the detoxes and the treatment programs now is where there's a huge barrier. I've probably been in every detox across this country and half of them in the United States. I've left after 4 hours because I couldn't smoke a cigarette, let alone a joint that would make me feel better. And it's not the doctors in many cases, it's staff that still carries on the baggage of the stigma and ties it to the stigma of being an opiate addict. And I find that the huge barriers are in these places where they go, oh, you're just substituting the chairs on the Titanic. Oh, fuck off. It makes me feel better. Is that an issue? Is that a problem? And this is the thing that I see. And I don't know how many of my people leave detox early because of that. Because if they come back and said, yeah, I just smoked a joint and I really feel good and I want to go lay down, they go, here's your exit papers.
Great comment. I think a good place to end this panel. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for the panelists. Thank you.